The Case of Jennie Brice by Mary Roberts Reinhardt. Read by Ghosty Keys. When last we left, Ladley had been let out, proven not beyond a reasonable doubt, but suspected, but not enough evidence to convict. And so he's moved back into the house, where several of the tenants, including the owner, testified against him. But they've rigged up a spying periscope through the house to see what he's up to. Was there a murder? We'll find out. That was Friday afternoon. All that evening, and most of Saturday and Sunday, Mr. Holcombe sat on the floor with his eye to the reflecting mirror and his notebook beside him. I have it sitting here before me. On the first page is the dog meat $2 entry. On the next, the description of what occurred Sunday night, March 4th, in the morning of Monday, March 5th. Following came a sketch made with a carbon sheet of torn paper found behind the washstand, which says robe, knife, shoe, towel, and horn. And then came the entries for Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and Friday evening. 6:30, eating hearty supper. 7 o'clock, lights cigarette and paces floor. Notice that when Mrs. P knocks, he goes to the desk and pretends to be writing. 8 o'clock, is examining book. Looks like a railway guide. 8:30, it's actually a steamship guide. 8:45, tailor's boy brings box. Gives boy 50 cents. Query, where does he get money now that JB is gone? 9 o'clock, tries on new suit, brown. 9:30, has spent a quarter of an hour on his knees looking behind furniture and examining the baseboard. 10 o'clock, he has the key to the onyx clock, has hidden it twice. Once up the chimney flue, once behind the baseboard. 10:15, he has just thrown the key, or some similar article, outside the window into the yard. 11 o'clock, has gone to bed, light burning. Shall sleep here on floor. 11:30. 11:30. Time is moving weird here. 11:30. He cannot sleep. Is up walking the floor and smoking. 2 a.m. Saturday. Disturbance below. He had a nightmare and was calling, Jennie! Got up and took a drink. Is now reading. 8 a.m. Must have slept. He's shaving. 12 a.m. Nothing this morning. He wrote for 4 hours, sometimes reading aloud what he had written. 2 p.m. Has a visitor, a man. Cannot hear all the words. Just a few every now and then. Llewellyn is the very man. Devil of a risk. We'll see you through. Lost the slip. Didn't go to the hotel. Went to a private house. Eliza Schaefer. I didn't know what to make of any of this. Who went to a private house? Jennie Brice? I can't hear. They're whispering. The visitor has given Ladley a roll of bills. 4 o'clock. Followed the visitor, tall man with a pointed beard. He went to the Liberty Theater. I found out it was Bronson, business manager there. But who is Llewellyn? And who is Eliza Schaefer? Had Mrs. P. bring telephone book. 6 Llewellyns in the book. No Eliza Schaefer. Ladley appears more cheerful since Bronson's visit. He has bought all the evening papers and is searching for something, but has not found it yet. 7 o'clock. Ate well. Have asked Mrs. P. to take my place here while I interview the 6 Llewellyns. 11 o'clock. Miss P. reports quiet evening. He read, he smoked, has gone to bed, light burning. I've seen 5 of the Llewellyns. None of them knew Bronson or Ladley. The 6th, a lawyer, out at a revival meeting, went to the church and walked home with him. He knows something. Acknowledged that he knew Bronson, had met Ladley. Did not believe Mrs. Ladley dead. I regretted I had not been to the meeting. He asked me for $1 for the missions. Sunday. Ladley in bad shape, apparently been drinking all night. Can't eat. Sent out for papers. Has searched them all. Found entry on second page. Stared at it and flung the paper away. Have sent out for the same paper. 10 a.m. Paper says, body of woman washed ashore yesterday at Sewickley. Much mutilated by flood debris. Ladley in bed staring at ceiling. Wonder if he sees the tube. He's ghastly. Well, that's the last entry in the notebook for that day. Mr. Holcombe called me in great excitement shortly after 10 and showed me the item. Neither of us doubted for a moment that was Jennie Brice who had been found. He started for Sewickley that same afternoon, and he probably communicated with the police before he left. For once or twice I saw Mr. Graves, the detective, sauntering past the house. Ladley ate no dinner, went out at 4, and I had Mr. Reynolds follow him. But they were both back in half an hour. Mr. Reynolds reported that Ladley had bought some headache tablets and some bromide powders to make him sleep. Holcombe came back that evening. He thought the body was that of Jennie Brice, but the head was gone. He was much depressed and did not immediately go back to the periscope. I asked if the head had been cut off or taken off by a steamer. He said he was afraid the latter, and a hand was gone too. It was about 11 o'clock that night that the doorbell rang. It was Mr. Graves, with a small man behind him. I knew the man. He lived in a shanty boat not far from my house. A curious affair with shelves full of dishes and tinware. In the spring, he would be towed up the Monongahela 100 miles or so, and then he would float down, tying up at different landings and selling his wares as he went. Timothy Sneft, he was called. We called him Tim. Mr. Graves motioned for me to be quiet. Both of us knew that behind the parlor door, Ladley was probably listening. Sorry to get you up, Mrs. Pittman, but this man says he has bought beer here today. That won't do, Mrs. Pittman. Beer? I haven't this thing in the house. Come in and look, I snapped. And the two of them went back into the kitchen. Now, said Mr. Graves when I had shut the door. Where's the dog meat man? Upstairs. Bring him quietly. I called Mr. Holcombe, and he came eagerly, notebook and all. Ah, so you've turned up. Yes, sir. It seems, Mr. Holcombe, said Mr. Graves, that you are right, partly anyhow. Tim here did help a man with a boat that night. Threw him a rope, sir, Tim broke in. He got out in the current, and what with the ice and his not knowing much about a boat, he'd have kept on all the way to New Orleans if I hadn't caught him. Maybe Kingdom Come. Exactly. And what time did you say this was? It was between 3 and 4 last Saturday night, Monday morning. He said he couldn't sleep and went out in a boat, meaning to keep in close to shore, but got drawn out by the current. And where did you see him first? By the 9th Street Bridge. Did you hail him? Well, he saw my light and hailed me. I was making fast to a coal barge after one of my ropes had busted. You threw him a line to there? No, sir. I tried to work in to the shore. I ran along River Avenue to below the 6th Street Bridge. He got pretty close in there, and I threw him a rope. He was about done up. Would you know him again if you saw him? Oh, yes, sir. He gave me $5. Said nothing about it. He didn't want anybody to know he had been such a fool. He told me not to tell anybody. They took him quietly up the stairs and then him looked through the periscope. And he identified Mr. Ladley, absolutely. When Tim and Mr. Graves had gone, Mr. Holcombe and I were left alone in the kitchen, and Mr. Holcombe leaned over and patted Peter as he lay in his basket. I think we've got him, old boy. The chain is just about complete. He'll never kick you again. But Mr. Holcombe was wrong. Not about kicking Peter, although I don't believe Mr. Ladley ever did that again either, but in thinking that we had him. I watched that next morning, Monday. But all the time I was rubbing and starching and hanging out, but my mind was with Jennie Brice. The sight of Molly Maguire next door at the house rubbing and brushing at her new fur coat only made things worse. At noon, when the Maguire youngsters came home from school, I bribed Tommy, the youngest, into the kitchen with the promise of a donut. I see your mother has a new fur coat, I said with a plate of donuts just beyond his reach. Yes'm. She didn't buy it. Oh no, she didn't buy it. Say, Miss Pittman, give me that donut. Oh, the coat washed in. No, Pap found it down by the point on a cake of ice. He thought it was a dog and rode out for it. Well, I hadn't wanted the coat, as far as that goes. I'd managed well enough without furs for 20 years or more, but it was a satisfaction to know that it had not floated into Mrs. Maguire's kitchen and spread itself at her feet, as one may say. But that was not the question after all. The real issue was that if it was Jennie Brice's coat, and it was found across the river on a cake of ice, then one of two things was certain. Either Jennie Brice's body, wrapped in the coat, had been thrown into the water out in the current, or she herself, hoping to incriminate her husband, had flung the coat into the river. I told Holcombe, and he interviewed Joe Maguire that afternoon. The upshot of it was that if Tommy had been correctly informed, Joe had witnesses who lined up, ready to see him rescue a dog, and had beheld his return in triumph with a wet, soggy fur coat. At 3 o'clock, Mrs. Maguire instructed Mr. Graves, and they brought the coat to me for identification, turning it about for my inspection, but refusing to take her hands off it. If her husband says to me that he wants it back, well and good, she said, but I don't give it up to nobody but him. Some folks I know would be glad enough to have it. Well, I was certain it was Jennie Brice's coat, but the maker's name had been ripped out. With Molly holding one arm and I the other, we took it to Mr. Ladley's door and knocked, and he opened it grumbling. "I have asked you not to interrupt me," he said, pen in hand. And then his eyes fell on the coat. "What's that?" he said, changing color. "I think it's Mrs. Ladley's fur coat," I said. He stood there looking at it and thinking, and then said, "It can't be hers. She wore hers when she went away." "Well, perhaps she dropped it in the water." He looked at me and smiled. "And why would she do that?" he said mockingly. "Was it suddenly out of fashion?" "That's Mrs. Ladley's coat," I persuaded, but Molly Maguire jerked it from me and started away. He stood there looking at me and smiling in his nasty way. "This excitement is telling on you, Mrs. Pittman. You're too emotional for detective work." And he slammed the door. When I went downstairs, Molly Maguire was waiting in the kitchen and had the audacity to ask me if I thought the coat needed a new lining. Well, it was on Monday evening that the strangest event happened in years. I went to my sister's house, and in fact, I was admitted at the side entrance. And that made it even stranger. It happened in this way. Supper was over, and I was cleaning up when an automobile came to the door. It was Alma's car. The chauffeur gave me a note. "Dear Mrs. Pittman, I am not at all well, and I'm very anxious. Will you come to see me at once? My mother is out to dinner, and I am alone. Car will bring you right now. Cordially, Lyda Harvey." What could I do? I put my best dress on at once and got into the limousine. Half of the neighborhood was watching. I leaned back in the upholstered seat, fairly quivering with excitement. This was Alma's car. That was Alma's card case. The little clock had her monogram on it. Even the flowers in the flower holder, yellow tulips, reminded me of Alma. A trifle showy, but good to look at. And I was actually going to her house. I was not taken to the main entrance, but to the side door. It was a queer, dreamlike feeling to be there. In this back hall, relegated from the more conspicuous parts of the house, there were even pieces of furniture from my old home, and my father's picture in an oval gilt frame hung over my head. I had not seen a picture of my own father for over 20 years. I went over and touched it gently. "Oh, Father." Under it was the tall hall chair that I had climbed over as a child and had stood on many times to see the mirror above. The chair was newly finished and looked better for its age. I glanced at the old glass. The chair had stood time better than I, for I was now middle-aged, lined with poverty and care, prematurely gray and perhaps a little hard now. I had thought my father an old man when that picture was taken, and yet today, even now, I am older. "Father," I whispered again, and fell to crying in the hall. Lyda sent for me at once, and I had only time to dry my eyes and straighten my hat. I met Alma on the stairs, and I would have passed her without a word. Had I met Alma on the stairs, I would have passed her without a word, and she wouldn't have even known me. But I saw no one. Lida was in bed. She was lying there with rose-shaded lamp beside her and a great bowl of spring flowers on the little stand at her elbow. She sat up when I went in and had a maid place a chair for me beside the bed. She looked very childish, with her hair in a braid and all on the pillow, her slim young arms and throat bare. "I'm so glad you came," she said, and would not be satisfied until the light was just right for my eyes and my coat unfastened and thrown open. "I'm really not ill," she informed me. I'm just tired and nervous and unhappy, Mrs. Pittman." "Well, I'm sorry." I wanted to lean over and pat her hand and to draw the covers about her and mother her a little, for I had no one to mother me for so long, but I could not. She would have thought it queer and presumptuous, and she was too sweet to know that I was her aunt. "Mrs. Pittman, who was Jennie Brice?" "Well, she was an actress. She and her husband lived at my house." "Was she beautiful?" "Well, I never really thought of that. She was handsome in a large way." "Was she young?" 28 or so." "Well, that isn't very young." "But I don't think men like..." "Well, that isn't very young." "But most men don't like women who are much younger." "Do you think so?" I smiled and said, "Well, I know one who does." She sat up in bed suddenly and looked at me with clear, childish eyes. "I don't want him to like me. I want him to hate me." "Oh, tut-tut, you want nothing of the sort." "Mrs. Pittman, I sent for you because I'm nearly crazy." "Mr. Howe is a friend of that woman. He has acted like a maniac since she disappeared. He doesn't come see me. He has given up his work on the paper. I saw him today on the street, and he looks like a ghost." And that put me to thinking. "He might have a friend," I admitted, "although as far as I know, he was never at the house but once, and then he saw both of them." "Well, when was that?" "Sunday morning, the day before she disappeared. They were arguing or something." She looked at me very attentively. "You know more than you're telling me, Mrs. Pittman. Do you think Jennie Brice is dead? Mr. Howe knows who did it?" "I do think she's dead. And I think possibly Mr. Howe suspects who did it. But he doesn't know, or I think he would have told the police." "You don't think he was in love with Jennie Brice, do you?" "No, I'm certain of that." "He is very much in love with a foolish girl who might have a little more faith in him than she does." Her face colored a little, and I smiled at that. The next moment she was sitting forward, tense and questioning again. "If that is true, Mrs. Pittman, who was the veiled woman he met Monday morning at daylight, took across the bridge to Pittsburgh?" "I believed it was Jennie Brice, but if not, who was it?" "I don't believe he took any woman across the bridge at that hour." "Who says he did?" "Uncle Jim saw him. He had been playing cards all night at one of the clubs and was walking home. He says he saw Mr. Howe face to face and spoke to him. And he was with a woman, tall and veiled. Uncle Jim sent for him a day or two later, and he refused to explain. Then they forbade him the house. Mom objected to him anyhow, and he only came on sufferance. He's a college man of good family, but without any money at all, and save what he earns, and now after this... I'd had some young newspapermen with me, and I knew what they'd got. They were nice boys, but they made $15 a week. I'm afraid I smiled a little as I looked around the room with its gray glass cloth walls and its toilet table spread with ivory and gold, and the maid in attendance in her black dress and white apron, collar, and cuffs, and in her little nightgown Lida was wearing, which would have taken a week's salary or more. She saw my smile. It has to be his chance. If he made good, if he was to have something better. My Uncle Jim owes him the paper, and he promised to help him, but... What? So Jim was running the newspaper? Well, that was a curious career for Jim to choose. Jim, twice expelled from school, and who could never learn to write a letter without a dictionary beside him. I had a pang when I heard his name again after all these years, for I had written to Jim from Oklahoma after Mr. Pittman died, asking for some money to bury him. But I had never heard a reply. And you haven't seen him since? Well, once I didn't hear from him. I called him up. We met in the park. He said everything was all right, and he couldn't tell me just then what was going on. And then the next day he resigned from the paper and went away, Mrs. Pittman. It's driving me crazy. For now they found a body and they think it's hers. If it's hers and he was with her... Don't be a foolish girl, I said. If he was with Jennie Brice, she is still living. If he was not with Jennie Brice... If it was not Jennie Brice, then I have a right to know who it was, she declared. He was not like himself when I met him. Such queer things. He talked about an onyx clock and said he'd been made a fool of, and no matter what came out, I was to always remember what he had done was for the best. He said he cared for me more than anything in the world. Well, that wasn't so foolish I couldn't help. And I leaned over and drew her nightgown up over her shoulder. You won't help anything or anybody by catching a cold. Now call your maid and have her put on a dressing gown around you. And I left soon after. There was little I could do, but I comforted her as best I could and said good night. My heart was heavy, and I went downstairs. For twist things as it might, it was clear that in some way the Howe boy was mixed up in this Brice case. Poor troubled Lida. Poor distracted boy. I had a final curious experience downstairs. I reached the foot of the staircase and was turning to go back along the hall towards the side entrance when I came face to face with Isaac. He was the man who had driven the family carriage when I was a child, and whom I had seen at intervals since I came back, pottering around Alma's house. The old man was bent and feeble, and he came slowly down the hall with a bunch of keys in his hand. I had seen him do the same thing so many times. He stopped when he saw me, and I shrank back from the light, but he had already seen me. Oh, Miss Bess. No, you're making a mistake. I'm not Miss Bess. But he came closer and stared in my face. And he looked at my cloth gloves and at my coat. And he shook his graying-haired head. I thought sure you was Miss Bess. But he made no further effort to detain me. He led the way to the back door when the machine waited, his head shaking with the palsy of age, muttering as he went. He opened the door with his best manner and stood aside. Then good night, ma'am. I had a tear in my eye and I tried to keep it back. Good night, Eggie. And it slipped out. It was my old name for Isaac. Oh, Miss Bess, I knew it was you. And he caught my arm and pulled me back into the hall and held me crying, muttering praises for my return and almost begging me to come back to the house, recalling many tender things out of the past that almost killed me to hear again. But I had made my bed and was more than comfortable to lie in it, and I forced him to swear silence about my visit. I made him promise not to reveal my identity to Lida, and told him, heaven forgive me, that I was well and prosperous and happy. Oh, Isaac, I would not let him come see me. But the next day, on my front porch came a basket with 6 bottles of wine and an old daguerreotype of my mother. Nor was it the last basket that I would receive. And that's chapter 8.